Okay, Professor Hildebrandt here with, this will be the first of 2 lectures for Chapter 5. So this is our first chapter that's really bringing us now into macroeconomics. So if you've already taken micro for our business majors that have to have both, this is where the material will divide, okay? Again, with this chapter, I'm just going to make 2 lectures. And so this is the first of a 2-part series on Chapter 5. So for the most part in a macro course, we focus on the U.S. national economy, okay? We don't have to. You can talk about a lot of different kinds of economies. An economy is just a structure of economic activity. We could look at it for a community, a city, right? A county, a region. Every fall we host at our institution a forecasting breakfast, and we focus mainly on the West Georgia region. So there's quite a few counties that we follow and track, okay, throughout the year. You could look at the economy of a country. Again, that's what we mainly do here in this course, a group of countries, or even the entire world. You could look at the global economy. This chapter is a little bit of a tease, okay? So this first part of the chapter, I'm going to throw out some terms that we will then follow up with in more detail in the following chapters of this unit. We'll look more closely in Chapter 6, for example, on this word right here, gross domestic product, or GDP, okay? This is a very important macroeconomic variable. It's basically, it shows production. Okay, that's what our GDP measurement basically does for us. So we define it as the market value of all final goods and services produced in the United States in a given time period. Okay, GDP. Again, we'll spend about half a chapter talking about it in Chapter 6. The U.S. economy is the largest and the most complex in world history. And so there's a lot of different pieces we could study, but this is a principles course, and so we will just touch on some highlights. To show you, though, how diverse and large our economy is, here's a graphic that I took from The Economist. This was quite a few years ago. This was actually, the data was as of 2009. I believe this was published, though, in 2014, maybe. So if you look at this, you're thinking, oh, okay, yeah, that's a map of the United States, right? Geographically, that's the map of the United States. But then you start to look more closely, and you're like, wait a minute. This is not Russia, right? This is Texas. Why does that say Russia? Because what it's showing you is that the state economy of Texas is this, in terms of GDP of 2009, was the same size as the GDP of Russia. That's right. So one state in the U.S., Texas, had a GDP that was the same size as the country of Russia. For most of you in my class, we live right here in the West Georgia area. Well, in 2009, the Georgia economy was the same size in terms of GDP as the country of Austria, okay? So just to try to give you some ideas of the size of the U.S. economy. And you can even see down here, it's showing you the largest. So California was the largest, followed by Texas, New York, Florida, and here we were, Georgia, rounding out about the top 10. Okay, economic fluctuations. So this is just the rise and fall of economic activity, or we say the change in business cycles. So it's normal to have some increases and then some dips, and then we grow some more, and then we shrink a little bit. Okay, that's normal. So we have what we call expansion cycles, and then we'll have a period of contraction. So an expansion is where our economy is growing. How do we know it's growing? Well, we're seeing increased production, so rising output. We see increases in employment, and therefore increases in income. On the other hand, in a contractionary phase, we see the opposite. Our economy is in a state of decline, and we see this by decreases in production, employment, and income. Another topic that we will touch on in a later chapter, specifically Chapter 7, is inflation. And inflation is just an increase in the overall price level of our economy. We'll talk more about that later. So here is a little graph showing you an example of those changes in the business cycle. So our economy starts to grow. We're expanding in this blue section. We reach what's called a peak, and then we start to contract, and we reach the bottom of trough, and then we grow some more, and then we decline, and then we grow. The important thing for economy is that in the long term, you want to see a positive growth trend. And that's what we typically see in our economy. So just some historical looks. The longest contraction that we had in the U.S. economy was a long time ago, 1873 to 79. It was 5.5 years long, okay? The longest expansion, I actually need to update this. It was from March of 91 through March of 2001, but that is no longer true. Our longest expansion now, when did it end? We beat this, I want to say, in fall of 2019. No, that wouldn't have been right. I guess it was this past fall, maybe, that we finally, we had an expansion that, no, it wouldn't have been because, sorry, y'all, I'm going to have to get back to y'all on this. I'll post something up in the class, but I want to say maybe fall of 19. That doesn't feel right, though. So I'm going to have to look into that. So, okay. The Great Recession was from December of 2007 through June of 2009. It wasn't as long as a lot of our other recessions that we had seen since the Great Depression, only 18 months long, but it was the most severe that we had seen, okay? And the truth is everything that's happened back in 2020 and the dips and things that our economy has taken, a lot of this, we call them, I thought that slide was next. We call them lagging indicators, so I'll get to that in a second. But it's after the fact, right? It's after we've already experienced it. Then we look back and we go, oh, this is what happened. This is how severe it was, or in the opposite, this is how great it was, okay? But that's kind of a looking back kind of thing. This is just showing, this is a graph showing the percent change in our GDP or production since right before the Great Depression, so since 1929. So you can see we start here deep in the red, right? Consecutive years of decreases in production, okay? And then our economy recovered. Looking more closer to present day, here was the Great Recession, okay? So we had a couple of years successfully, years of decreased production there. The point of this one is just to kind of show that our major economies kind of trend together. So this red line is representing changes in production for the U.S., and the blue was the United Kingdom. They're not mirror images of each other, but they're really dang close. Again, here was the Great Recession, and you can see they were pretty much identical to each other for that time period. So here we go, these economic indicators. So we have 3 different kinds of economic indicators: leading economic indicators, coincident indicators, and then lagging. Leading are predictive in nature. So they're going to predict what is coming. So we pay close attention to things like changes in stock market returns, building permits for new construction. Okay, those all signal where we think the economy is heading. Our coincident indicators are reflecting the changes as they're happening. So what is GDP this quarter? What were retail sales in the fourth quarter of 2020? Okay, those are your coincident indicators. Lagging indicators, as I mentioned earlier, follow those changes. It's like you're looking in the rearview mirror, you're seeing what's already behind you. So when we look at the unemployment rate during the pandemic, the unemployment rate during the Great Recession, the average duration, how long were people unemployed, right? Like, maybe not for everyone, but for a lot of people during the pandemic, unemployment didn't last a long time. Maybe it was only 6 months long, right? Whereas in the Great Recession, we had people that were unemployed for 3 or 4 years, a lot longer, okay? So those are called lagging indicators. Okay, so this brings us to the next part of this chapter. We're going to talk about something called aggregate demand. So we talked in chapter 4 about demand for one product, right? This time we're going to talk about demand for all goods and services. So for some terms, aggregate output is the total amount of goods or services produced. You'll also hear us call it real GDP, and I'll get in more to that topic in a second. So aggregate output, total production. And again, the word aggregate, in case we need to review this really quickly, just kind of means like everything, okay? So the total, all right, summing it all together, okay, everything. Well, aggregate demand then is the relationship between our economy's price level and our total output, our aggregate output, okay, demanded in our economy. So let's talk about these terms a little bit more. So price level is what we call a composite measure. So here's the deal. We need something, if we're going to show total demand in our economy, prices are not the same, right? We talked about demand in chapter 4, relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. Well, look, the price of pizza versus a car versus a computer versus your cell phone service, those are all very different prices, right? So we need a composite measure that will reflect the prices of all goods and services relative to prices in a base year. So that's how a price index works. You're always comparing back to whatever your base year is, okay? So this is an index, and a very important fact, your index is always 100 in the base year. Now, the cool thing is we get to change what our base year is. We get to change what we're comparing to. But whatever we compare to, that index will always be 100. And I'll show y'all that later on. So real GDP. I said that aggregate output was total output produced in our economy, and we call it real GDP. Well, remember, GDP, gross domestic product, is total production. Well, the word real, I call it a qualifying word. It just means adjusted for inflation, okay? When you see the word real, you need to think adjusted for price changes, adjusted for inflation. That's what the word real means. So if real GDP changes from year to year, it's not changing because prices changed. It's changing because we truly had a change in our total production. We either made more stuff this year or we made less. That's real GDP. So here's what our aggregate demand curve looks like. Again, just like regular demand, there is an inverse relationship. So we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. But this time, instead of having price on the vertical axis, I have that index called price level. And then down here, instead of quantity, I have real GDP, total production, adjusted for inflation. This whole 2009 equals 100, that means that my base year for this graph was 2009, okay? And so here's my aggregate demand curve showing that entire relationship between the economy's price level and total output demanded. So let's move on to talk about supply. It's very similar, building off of the principles from chapter 4, and then we've already talked about it in terms of aggregates. So total output supplied by all firms for all goods and services, that gives us aggregate supply, okay, the total. We're going to have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, so there's going to be, again, that positive relationship. And we're going to assume some things are constant along the curve. Resource prices aren't going to change, the state of technology won't change, and rules of the game are not going to change. So when the two get together and meet, they look like this. So this was our U.S. economy in 2014. Again, you can see we were using 2009 as a base year. And so where the two curves intersect is, again, equilibrium. X marks the spot right here. Here's my equilibrium, okay, for the economy. And so in 2014, my equilibrium price level was 108.3. I know that doesn't mean anything yet, but it will later. And my real GDP was $16.1 trillion 2009 dollars. Here's another example just to show you that the base year can change. So here was our economy in 2009. Well, that's what we were using as a base year. You can't use it as a base year. Like, you for that year, you have to have a different year as a base year. So for this one, we're using 2005 as a base year. Well, in 2009, my price level was 110.7, and my real GDP was 13.2 trillion. Okay, so what does it mean? Well, in terms of my prices, it means they were 10.7% higher than 2005 prices, okay? And I have a video for this already, but just really quick, so this is where I call it the percent change formula, and you take new minus old over old and multiply times 100. So you take the new price level, 110.7, you subtract the old price level of 100, you divide by 100, and multiply times 100 to get that increase in prices of 10.7%. Again, there's another video where I show more examples on that. So just like in Chapter 4 with changes in demand, we can have changes in aggregate demand. And so when we have a change in aggregate demand, what does it mean? It means that in each and every price level, there is an increase or decrease in the aggregate quantity of goods and services demanded. What can it be caused by? Well, consumption spending by households. So households either want to spend more or spend less. That influences aggregate demand. Investment spending by firms. Remember, when we're talking about investment spending by firms, I'm talking about capital in an econ course. I'm talking about investing in new machines, new buildings, new fleet vehicles, new airplanes, right? That capital, those things that have jobs to do, they help us produce other goods and services. It could also be government spending, so government purchases on goods and services, or it could be a change in net exports. So increasing or decreasing either what we're importing into the country or what we're selling outside, exporting out of the country. Again, just like in Chapter 4, if we have a change in aggregate demand, then we have a shift of the aggregate demand curve. If it increases, shifting to the right, we will see a higher price level and a higher real GDP in our economy. This, on the other hand, is showing the opposite. So this was showing a decrease in aggregate demand that our economy saw from 1929 to 1933. I'm usually not too big on dates, but y'all need to know those 4 years right there. That is the Great Depression, okay? So this darker blue line was our aggregate demand in 29. Over the course of 4 years, we shifted to the left. So that is a decrease in aggregate demand to this lighter blue line for the aggregate demand in 33. What happened? Well, our price level dropped from 9.9 to 7.3, and our real GDP dropped as well. Okay, that's going to be my stopping point for this one. Again, there's a video on calculating price index, but we'll talk more about it later. So you can catch that on my YouTube channel as well. And look for a second video to finish up Chapter 5. Thanks, guys.